Perfect. Thank you everyone for attending. I really appreciate it. I know it's a bit it's a lot to ask sometimes, certainly to take your nights off and spend some time attending a webinar. So I really appreciate everybody that's here. The format, just to go over it really quickly. I'm going to go through the presentation, which is going to be about leadership and the potential of people, of course. And if you have questions throughout the presentation, please pop them into the Q&A section. And at the very end, I'll address each and every one, however many there are, and obviously offer people an opportunity to also just engage in a conversation if you'd like to stay for that as well. So without further ado, let's get started here. So not bad. I think the focus is off. So welcome. So welcome to a webinar here brought to you by Skilldemie, which is a boutique agency focused on professional training for professionals, professional training for professionals. Whether you're a project manager, delivery lead, you're involved in technology, development, marketing, engineering, and leadership, there's definitely something here for you. So it's been a really great experience so far, and I'm really thankful to have been participating as an advisor here at Skilldemie. So thanks very much, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. So a little bit about myself. I'm Dennis, as you know. Some of you actually on this call I've worked with, so welcome and thank you for attending. I've been around a little while. I think it's
Dennis?
over.
Sorry.
Yep. Yeah.
I don't think you're sharing the screen.
Oh my goodness. My apologies. Wow, that's a mess. Let's try that one again. Thank you, Resh. So as I said, I've been around for about 25 years in the industry. I started off my career as a developer. And I really, after a number of years being an individual contributor in that regard, I really wanted to take a leadership path. So I was really curious about how I could be involved in managing teams and really trying to help my teams and my organization and obviously the customers that we serve. That was really interesting and exciting for me. And I fundamentally just believed, and there's more potential that exists in people, which sort of set me onto this path. So let's move it on here. So the way I'm sort of framing this, and the reason I'm doing this is because everyone's context is unique and different. So to sit here and tell you what you should do in your context is a little weird. So what I'm going to do is really sort of look back on my own history, and I put quite a bit of thought into this and reflection. And what advice would I give myself as a young leader and manager of people, that if I had learned some of these things, if I had focused a little sooner on them, if I'd came to the realization about some of the things I'm going to share today, I think it would have been really helpful for me and for the teams that I'm working with, or I was working with as well. So this is really from the perspective of what advice would I give myself? What are sort of the lessons learned? And there's 4 areas that I've really identified, and there's certainly more when it comes to leadership. The first one, and this is the one that set me on this path, is I really believe that there's a lot more potential that exists in people and those that are perhaps on your team in leadership than we see in front of us on a day-to-day basis. And if we can somehow unlock that potential, I really think that there's an incredible opportunity to not only do better work, do more work if that's what we're after, but also be happier while we're doing it. And that's really kind of what drove a lot of my inspiration and why I chose to go down this particular path. This hope and this belief in the potential that exists in people. And potential is one of those things that's not really quantifiable when you're talking about human potential, because it's about things that you haven't yet done, things that you haven't yet either realized or learned or grown in certain ways. And I believe, again, tied to this, that from the moment that we're born to the moment we're no longer here, there's always opportunities to grow, always opportunities to learn. And what we see in front of us, whether it's from ourselves, our teams, our leaders, it's a snapshot, and there's certainly more. And I believe there's a lot more that we can unlock. And I think leadership is the way that, or at least one of the ways that we can go about unlocking that potential for those of us privileged and fortunate enough to have, the responsibilities of leading and managing people. So that's really where this came from. And the advice to myself in this particular area is not only to, keep believing in the potential of people, but extend it not only to your team, but to your leaders as well, because that's often one of those things that, sometimes we think, and certainly when I was much younger than I am today, that our leaders knew everything. And I think, the honest truth is that they don't, and it's okay that they don't. But the leaders who really sort of cultivate the environments where people and the relationships they have with them are really strong and productive and effective, you can solve an incredible amount of things, and you can increase, the potential, not just the potential, but realizing that potential within people. And I think that's a really great thing and a really rewarding thing once you set yourself on this path. The second is context, and this is the one where I've, tripped up a number of times, certainly earlier on, and I'm sure I probably will a few more times before I'm done here, in terms of my career. But context is really important because you can read all the articles you want. You know, um, you can go to lots of courses, which are obviously helpful and obviously valuable, but knowing what to apply within your context is where the rubber sort of meets the road. And what I mean by that is, your context is unique. So all of this that I'm sharing here today is really about my context, my personal journey, and the context that I've had as I sort of progressed through various organizations, excuse me. And, my context and what I've been able to extract and learn and sort of synthesize from it is that which is very much applicable to my own. Some of these things will apply to yours, but you have to be the one to decide, hey, this might work for me or my team, this may not. It's really about you thinking about and understanding your context, what is within your control or sphere of influence and what is not, because sometimes those are these things that are out of our hands and out of our control, and we really need to work with what we have. And the advice to myself is, to not try to apply something you've read or something you may have heard somewhere, that may have worked in one organization or in one specific context, and just assume that's going to work perfectly in your own. And that's something that I've, frankly been burned on several times, because your own context is very unique. So apply, what you feel will work, and then learn, adapt, pivot, adjust as necessary. So context is really important. That's the second area that I really would encourage my younger self to focus on. The third is one of what I believe is one of the most valuable um, aspects of leadership, and that's courage. It's one of the undervalued sort of skills that I feel that really strong leaders that I've had a chance and privilege to work with did this pretty well. They had courageous conversations. They made decisions, and sometimes that were unpopular. Because they really believed, and there was data even supporting that it was the right decision, even though there's a lot of people telling them, otherwise. The courage also to lift up those around you. And that's another big one. And that's really what I believe leadership is about. It's about helping others, moving us towards goals and objectives that we're trying to set for our business and our customers, and having the courage to do that, by lifting up those around us, because there's very little in an organizational context, certainly at scale, that any one of us can achieve on our own. It almost always requires teams and groups of people, teams of teams to do. So, having the courage to focus on helping all of them, helping everyone, and creating those environments where that potential can be unlocked will allow your organization and your teams to better achieve and more likely achieve those objectives that they're going after. So courage is a really important one. And the fourth is trust. This one probably goes without saying. And these, by all means, are not an exhaustive list. You can come up with a lot more things that from your own perspective may resonate a little more with you. But this one is sort of last, but certainly not least on my bucket list of things that I wish I had probably just spent more time cultivating, nurturing, because as a leader, as a manager of people, trust is really at the foundation of everything. And if you're a fan of Lencioni and his books, like the Five Dysfunctions of a Team, trust is really the base of that pyramid, and everything, layers on top of that. Because without trust, it's really hard to lead. You can still get work done. But if you want to be able to scale, trust is a much better way to scale than control or certain unhealthy versions of control. So trust is one that I wish I spent a little more time when I was younger. I feel I'm certainly more comfortable with it now, but it is another area that I think those who either are leaders or are choosing to pursue a leadership path should really spend time and work on ways to nurture and build those environments and cultures of trust. And this is a quote that I read not too long ago, but it really resonated with me. And it was by Dr. Henry Cloud from his book, Boundaries for Leaders. He says, leaders get what they create or what they allow. Um, and I really believe that to be true. He also says, leaders are ridiculously in charge. So, if you believe that you are in charge, and if that is in fact the case, if you have been um, if you are someone with, areas that you have, span of control over, you can create or allow a lot of things. And I've seen both the some of the best environments that I've ever worked in, and also some of the not so great environments as a result of this quote coming to life. The leaders who were very intentional about creating those environments where there was healthy debate, there was constructive conflict, versus those who didn't, or had the complete opposite effect, or even allowed. And I've been guilty of this in my earlier days, certainly just sort of allowing the culture to sort of develop. There's certainly something to be said for allowing space for people to grow and evolve. I'm not referring to that. I think that's still important, but it's important to set certain boundaries as well so that we have a context as well. Oh yeah, and again, by all means, if you have questions, I'm going through them, just pop them into the Q&A, and I'll make sure I'll address them right at the end, and then we can have a conversation for anybody who'd like to stay. So continuing on the topic of your context. So knowing your context, what does your environment look like? So this is an important thing. And again, a real learning for me as I was developing as a young leader in the industry. And again, the mistake I made was assuming that what worked in one organization certainly could work in mine. And what I found was there was different levers that could be pulled. So when we're thinking about prioritization, are you working in an environment where prioritization is really clear and easy, and we know what the most important thing is that we need to work on? Or is it really difficult? Are there like 5 or 10 priorities and they're all vying for your attention? What sort of environment and tolerance for failure exists within your organization? And, that varies quite a bit depending on the context. So organizations like the military and emergency services, certainly not the environments where I've spent my career. But what I have come to really appreciate about these environments that I think when we can do better, and when following their example, is they're really good at prioritization, right? They're really good at knowing what the goal is in an emergency and something that's immediate and where you need to focus. That focus based on that priority becomes really clear, and it happens really quickly. And I find that's what organizations in the fields that I've operated in really struggle. So the more as a leader you can help create that clarity and create that focus, the better your teams will perform. So anytime you are given the mandate to do these 5 things, and they're all equally important and they all need to get done at once, I would encourage you to ask, that's great, they all are important, but which of these is most urgent right now? Right. So you move from hopefully having this massive list of all these things where you're going to context switch and waste a tremendous amount of time to focus and knowing which one is most important right now. And that type of question often helps create a little bit more focus and clarity. Another thing about understanding your context in the technology field, where I've been working for a number of years, is also whether you're working on projects or products. And this is important when, for instance, thinking about whether you're going to take an agile approach, and that's how you're going to be deciding to work and your team, or not. And often this is where I've gotten it a little mixed up as well, because agile can be fantastic, and I'm a huge advocate for agile, but I also recognize that some environments are not exactly the most conducive to agile. And we'll get to how to sort of identify some of those things. But if you're working with projects, there's a lot of things that are fixed, right? They're often dealing with definitely fixed scope, fixed costs, fixed time. Agile tends to struggle in teams that are trying to apply Agile within those environments a little bit. So you might want to just think about that when you're trying to understand and define your context before you figure out what tool or approach you may use in one or the other. The other is just generally referred to as control, but really it talks about in understanding your context, what are the things you have control or influence and what are the things you don't? And that's going to be really also important in deciding which approach or which tool or which tactic you use. The Serenity Prayer that you may know or may not know, it's a pretty famous one. It's old. It's by Niebuhr. It talks about, having, have the serenity to accept, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And, I've been thinking about that one a lot as well as I reflect back on my career. And there were so many times where I really didn't have a good grasp of the things that were in my control and the things that weren't. And I very likely spent a lot more time trying to change the things that were not in my control. And in those situations, at least not my control in that moment, things can sometimes change, and that definitely happens. But if it's truly something you can't control, then investing a tremendous amount of time and energy and other resources is probably not the best use of your time, and you're better off figuring out what can you do something about, what can you move the needle on, and really focusing in that area. So that's another one that I think a lot about, and I certainly take it to heart wherever I am these days as well. Which brings me to speaking of one of the one of the things about knowing your context and how important it is related to Agile. And there's this document called the Agile Manifesto, or specifically the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. It was a document that was created, I believe, in 2001. So it's approaching, almost 24-ish, 25-year mark. It's an old document, and the environment at that time was very different than the environment today. Companies, it wasn't uncommon for a company to take 6 months, 1 year, 2 years to release a major software update to their products and services, which, when you think about it these days, that's like insane. Not to mention they weren't very customer centric, which is just, this is just how you need to operate. It's accepted universally these days. So the industry has changed. And I believe this document is one of the reasons, not the only reason, why the shift has happened. Because, um, as much as I've seen a lot of folks grumble about Agile and how it wasn't successful in their organizations, I think it has done a lot of good for a lot of other organizations and has actually created a shift in our industry. But when I talk to people who have really struggled with Agile, and I myself have as well, and I believe it's because Agile was attempted in an organization in that context that really wasn't a great fit for it. And I'm not surprised looking back now, my own history, my own experiences where it wasn't super successful or successful at all, because what our company valued was not the same as what was defined in this document. Right? This document was intended to be geared towards the software development industry, right? It's written by these individuals who are very experienced, very technical. But what you'll notice if you've ever read this document, and I highly encourage you to do so, is that nowhere in this document does it talk about what technologies you should use. They don't tell you what programming language you should use, what framework, what tools, or anything of that nature. They talk about values and principles. And the best organizations that operate in these high performing ways and get these levels of performance from their teams, these are what they follow. They follow values and principles. It doesn't specify, you must use IBM mainframe 400 or whatever it was at the time, or you must use Java as a programming language. It talks about, what do you care about as an organization? And you either care about these things more than these other things, or you don't. And I have found, of the four values, there's two of them that come up almost most frequently in my experiences where organizations have struggled with Agile. And if you honestly ask the question to the leaders of your organization and ask them, do we really value individuals and interactions more than we value process and tools? If the answer isn't yes, you're probably going to struggle a little bit or maybe a lot with Agile. Same with responding to change over following a plan. Do we really value responding to change more than we value following a plan? chances are there's going to be a lot of organizations, if they're being honest about answering those two questions, are going to be, no, that's not really us. We value the other stuff more. I'm not even judging whether it's right or wrong. I'm just saying, if you're trying to be agile, you're going to have a hard time being agile and then getting the results that you're expecting if these are the things, these are the values that you fundamentally just don't believe in. The principles there's 12 of. I won't go into them, but again, just an example around building projects around motivated individuals, giving them the environment and support they need and the trust to get the job done. Does that sound like your organization? Just thinking back again, where maybe agile may not have been the best fit. And the answer, if folks are being honest, where it's been very difficult, is probably, that's not really like us. We don't really do that. And again, that's okay. It doesn't mean you can't get value from adopting some of these things. You can still move things forward. But if your expectation is that you're going to be able to unlock this incredible vast amount of potential, and you're struggling to understand why that's not the case, I would always look back to this and ask yourself the honest questions of, how well do we align to these as an organization? If the answer is no, then you probably have your answer there. Let's go. And often, when I was, again, also coming up as sort of, someone that was interested in leadership and people management, it was often hard to figure out where to even start. And what I've tended to come back to more and more is, again, similar to what I was just talking about with regards to the Agile Manifesto, is values and principles. And most organizations that I've worked at have values. Very few of them had principles defined. And there's a difference between the two. They're definitely not the same. And I don't use them in the same way either, but they are both important. So when I think about values, values are the things that you really fundamentally believe in at your core. They're very personal to you, and they do guide your behavior. The thing with values, though, is that they can be rather subjective. So in an organization, that value has a value of, respect. We respect everyone and each other. What that means to one person versus another can be really different. So, I might work in an organization where the value of respect is interpreted by my boss as, for instance, and I'm making this up, I'm not saying this is true, I see respect when someone doesn't question me. Whereas someone else might be thinking, and I would tend to agree with, I want someone to question my decisions because I want to come up with the best decision. I'm not concerned about being offended. I'm concerned about making sure we make the best decision we can make. And sometimes I'm going to get it wrong, and I'm okay with that, as long as we come up with the best decision with the information we have. I see that, and the courage required to give that sort of feedback, as the highest form of respect that someone can give me. So that's why values can be a little squishy, subjective. So what helps define them better, and sort of brings them down that next level where it's actually much more concrete as a set of rules, are principles. And I think you need them both. And values I use often to, as part of hiring. I use principles as well, but values, again, will give you an indication whether the person you're hiring is like your team and yourself. You value and you believe in the same things. And that's important, because groups of people who believe in the same things, who have, the same sort of core values, work better together and perform at a higher level. So that's why values are important. Principles set sort of the rules that we're going to follow when it comes to working together. How are we going to make decisions? How are we going to support each other? Right? These are clear guidelines. One of them, I'm just pulling one off the top of my head, like a company like Amazon might have a principle, and it's framed generally, but you still, it's defined once you talk to someone who can explain it further for you, is like disagree and commit. So you may have heard of the principle of disagree and commit at Amazon. It's a fairly well-known one, where they encourage everybody to disagree during times where we're debating ideas and trying to come up and make a decision, looking at options and making a decision. But once we commit to that decision, that choice, we fully support it. Regardless of whether you disagreed with it during the debate period or not, it's important for us all to commit to the decision. That way, that option, whatever that choice was, stands stands the best chance of success possible. Otherwise, if one person's rowing in that direction, everybody's rowing in the other direction, it creates a tremendous amount of disruption, and it definitely hurts productivity. So that's an important principle for Amazon, and they talk about it and you'll have your own. I certainly have my own. There's a link there. I get into much more depth around these things and how you can use both values and principles within your own teams, whether you're hiring, whether you're looking to have, conversations, whether it's feedback, whether it's performance management. Weaving these into every part of your business really shows that these are things that matter to you, and you're looking for people who also value these things, both the values and the principles. This is another idea that came to me a little later in my career, and I wish it had hit home earlier. And this is the idea of the difference between family and sports team. And often we refer to those on our team or those in our organization as members of our family. And there's a lot of things in common between families and sports teams, such as individuals in both of these groups respect each other, trust each other, support each other, through tough times and through good times. That's all great, but I think it can be a little misleading sometimes in an organizational context to really be towing this line that we're all family, and then you see, which often happens, organizations need to make sometimes hard choices. They need to restructure. They need to lay people off. We didn't hit our targets this quarter. We need to start talking about performance and, performance management. That doesn't really apply in a family context, not the same way that it does in a business. I'm not going to have kids and then fire and replace them if they don't deliver on their quarterly numbers this year, right? And I'm not going to fire grandma if she didn't bring home the bacon either. So these are sort of, silly examples, but I think as a leader, I think it's important to be clear with everyone that, listen, we're going to work really hard, but we do need to perform, and we're going to support each other. And I'm going to do everything I can to create the environment where you can be your best. And I'm here to see you grow. Um, at the end of the day, we all need to perform. This is not pointing the fingers like someone else needs to and I don't. I'm part of that as well. We are all part of this. We all need to perform and deliver if we're going to be a successful organization and we're going to grow. So that's one there that just something to think about. And I've had this conversation with a team before, and actually, I think they were very pleased in that, with certainly in that moment where there was this clarity. It was like, you know what, whether they agreed or disagreed with it, they were glad that a decision was made, and this is how we were going to operate moving forward. And that was actually really encouraging to sort of to see that and hear the feedback, which was actually positive out of that conversation. So if we're talking about performance and we recognize that in businesses, performance is important, especially for teams, well, how do you do that? Do you just tell people to perform and that's just what they're going to do? Well, not exactly. This brings up another analogy that came to me a little later in my career, and I wish it was sooner, is this analogy of, a leader as a gardener. Versus a command and control style of leadership, and the gardener is someone who achieves results from the flowers or fruits or whatever it is or vegetables they're trying to grow, not by forcing or telling those things to be beautiful or be whatever they are, but the way they go about it is by creating the right environment, creating the right conditions so that whether it's flowers or fruits or vegetables can achieve their potential. And this is something I think about a lot more as well now, is like, what can I do when we're talking about intentional leadership? Be the gardener. Be intentional about creating that environment where your people can grow, where your people can achieve their potential. We're talking about leadership and unlocking potential. This is kind of the way. This is how you can do that. And when I've been able to operate in this way most successfully, I've had the best results. And this is also what I would share with my younger self. I wish I had come to these realizations and used some of these practices and strategies much sooner in my career. I think I would have not only helped my teams, I would have helped myself, and I would have helped my organizations even more had I sort of came to some of these realizations sooner. So these are some of the advice that I would give my younger self as well. Sorry. All right. So a little riddle here, which brings us sort of to the next topic, where the rubber starts hitting the road a little more. Is I can be spent, saved, or wasted, but never owned. Everybody wants more of me, yet I'm always running out. What am I? And if you haven't guessed, it's time. In my opinion, the most precious resource in the world, basically, because yeah, I mean, you can't make more of it if you wanted to. Even though that riddle talks about saving it, you don't really save time either. Time is always continuing on. It's always being spent, is how I like to think about it. What you have is the choice of where you spend that time. And by the way, if you don't make a choice, time still is spent. So just try to keep that in mind. So it's really critical for businesses and teams to try to make the most of that time and to try to put energy and efforts towards things that are going to obviously deliver value and achieve the results. So thinking about time and making the best use of the time that we have is really, really important. And here's some um, tips basically for better performance. This is certainly, again, not an exhaustive list. There's so many more areas and you can go very deep into each one of these. And I certainly do go much more depth into the course that I'm gonna have a little later on. But one of the biggest time wasters, in my opinion, and you can find plenty of evidence out there on the internet, is context switching. And I actually have this Miro game that shows how that happens in a very simple example, and I'll walk a team through that as well in that course. But context switching is a productivity killer. It just is. So, and often I use this example earlier. If you're given the mandate that, these 5 things are all really, really important, they all just need to get done. That's fine. They can all be really important, but which of these is most important right now? Because if I try to do all 5 of these things simultaneously, there's a pretty good chance I'm going to be context switching across at least a few of them. And, I think it's like one context switch or between 2 things reduces your productivity by something like 20 or 25%. Once you get to like 3, it drops it like down by 40. You could lose a tremendous amount of time, waste time. It's not really lost. It's spent by context switching. So really being conscious about this is going to really go a long way. And this could really supercharge some of the things that your teams are doing. By the way, for those of you that have joined late, I will get to all the questions at the very end. Thank you. Please go ahead and keep asking them. I'm going to definitely go through every single one of them at the very end of this. Some ways that you could reduce context switching. So I just list a couple of them here. There's certainly other things that you can consider and look at. Limiting WIP, work in progress. This is something that is probably familiar to those of you who do some form of agile, whether it's Scrum or Kanban. But you could limit WIP in other contexts as well. You don't necessarily need to be adopting agile to limit how much work is in that's happening in progress. And again, by doing that, you help reduce context switching for people, and it helps save or at least make better use of time. And I already used the example of asking the question, what's most important right now? And you can't always get to a single thing. That's sort of like the ideal goal. But if you can get close to one, make it fewer than however many you start with, that's still an improvement. It still moves you forward in the right direction. So that's always what I would encourage. Asynchronous communication. So this one, where possible. So a tool like Slack, and I run into this one all the time, where there seems to be this real bias to having full-blown conversations over a tool like Slack. And Slack is really, really good for certain things. If you want to send out information, if it's sort of like a one-way communication, just updating, informing you, it's great. If you want to have a very quick answer to a question, something that's binary, even like yes or no, 0 or 1, perfect, great for those quick sort of hits. But having a full conversation or a full, basically, analysis of tackling a problem, trying to solve it over Slack, I would very much encourage you to steer away from that. Partly because, well, mostly because it takes more time. The time it takes to write the messages, wait for the other person to receive it, the other person to read it, and assume that they interpret it correctly and not make a mistake, which just costs more time, and then respond to you, that back and forth takes much longer than if you just had a conversation. And these are really simple tips. You may already be using these. I hope you are. But if you see your teams trying to break down a problem over Slack and it's taking more than 5 minutes, I would strongly encourage somebody to encourage them to get onto a call. And I've done that before. I've done that before, and it was a really I was really proud of the decision. I wish I did more of that when I was younger because I thought asynchronous tools and communication were just all the rage and they were amazing. But they can be productivity killers, so just be mindful of those as well. Swarm hard problems. So as someone who has managed developers, very often, and not just developers, very often the typical approach to tackling tickets is divide and conquer. Everybody take a ticket, regardless of what ticket it is. And that works really well for really simple tasks. But if the task is complex, if it's really hard to figure out, I strongly encourage putting more than one person on the task at once. Have two people try to solve it. Generally speaking, two brains are better than one. They will come to a solution, again, in my own experience, generally speaking, much faster than a single developer toiling and trying to solve something and really struggling with it. And you often end up in these long, loops of, a day or two or three passes, and they're still working on it. I don't doubt that the person is trying their best and working on it. But when they've received help and someone else has joined them to problem solve it, it gets accomplished much, much faster. So keep an eye out for that one as well. There's definitely a place for the divide and conquer approach, but with really hard problems, that one can work against you sometimes. Another famous saying that I like, and again, I also wish I had sort of used it and thought about and kept an eye on it sooner, was stop starting and start finishing. And this is another thing that you see in Scrum teams from Scrum coaches where they're like, we have a tremendous amount of tickets on the board, and everything is starting to pile up right before done, typically in like a QA column or testing or a something like that. Get those tickets to done. Even if a developer has to help contribute to that, it's often better in terms of clearing the board and getting a ticket to done, because those tickets that are close to done are of higher typically priority than anything else that comes to the left of them. So what's happening is that high priority item, that PBI, that product backlog item, is sitting there and it's not delivering value, or doesn't even have a chance to, until it at least gets to done. And often it's even past that. So get it to done. So finishing and sorry, stop starting and stop finishing, because there is this bias to pick up more work, and it just creates more whip in the system and it slows things down. So get things to done, push it over the finish line. And another one that's very similar to that is 99% finished is 0% done. So I repeat those ones sometimes as well, and they've often also helped my teams kind of think about, how do we get these things over the finish line? We want them over the finish line because they're not done till they're over the finish line. So I strongly encourage anyone who can contribute to doing it, even if it means a little bit of testing, for instance, to do it, because it helps the team. Another practice that I really like, that I've sort of learned a little later in my career, is walking the board, not from left to right, but from right to left. And again, it encourages identifying items that are close to done and then pulling them to done, figuring out what needs to get done to get them over to done as soon as possible, clearing those out of the board, and then thinking about picking up the next items of priority. Utilization. Typically, I'll get to this quote, but utilization is another. It just feels like it's this thing that managers, leaders really love focusing on. It's like, are we fully utilized? Is our backlog full? Is everyone working on something? You see those types of examples. And the challenge with overutilization, when you pack a backlog full, or you overload a team or a person with work, is that there's no room, there's no slack for all of the things that always inevitably happen, that are going to be interruptions, that are going to need to take time as well. And, the example here is, when you think about utilization, a highway that's 100% utilized is a traffic jam. The cars do not flow because there is no space. And as soon as that happens, everything backs up. And that happens to work and to people as they're trying to accomplish too many things at once. So leave slack in the system. Don't pack the backlog full. Put in fewer items rather than keeping it full. The work will flow generally much better. And that's, again, that one there is leave room in the sprint backlog. General rule of thumb, 20%. I've certainly left much more than that. In an ideal situation, I would pull in items as they come in. So following more of a Kanban approach, as opposed to having all of these items. It just adds to the cognitive load of the team and of the individuals. So keeping it light, because as soon as you pull something in, you can always grab more. there's nothing preventing you. There's no rule that says you can't. In fact, that's exactly what you should do. So pull in more work as opposed to pushing work into the team will generally work better. All right, I think I'm fairly close to the end here. Communication overhead. So yeah, this is another one. So if you've ever seen or been, and I certainly have, part of an organization or a team, part of a project, let's say, that's running late, and you start adding more people to it, what inevitably happens is that project just gets later, right? It takes more time to get those new people onboarded. And in order to do that, you're taking time, that valuable, precious time that I talked about, from the people who are already on the project, who are already trying to get work done, and now they have to work to get others up to speed. You actually slow the entire system down. So in fact, you should probably be scaling down as opposed to scaling up in some of these cases. So be very conscious of that. Comfortable numbers, I like to use are 7 plus or minus 2, 2 pizza boxes, a general rule of thumb. You've probably heard of that from Amazon. There's actually more context behind it than just communication overhead. Certainly, it talks about dependencies as well. You want to sort of keep it within a team that you could feed with 2 pizza boxes, but it also keeps down communication overhead. So teams that are generally smaller have much less of it, and that's that example over here, just to the right of it. Obviously, as teams grow, the communication overhead really starts getting out of control, and that's going to slow you down as well. Another sort of analogy I use, this champagne tower, it's just really around prioritizing work and how to sort of think about, getting work done. The work sort of flows out of the bottle it's more like your resources are what's coming out of bottle. They tackle the first most important thing, and then they sort of flow and cascade on down. And that's sort of the sort of cascade effect that happens. If you think about one side of a champagne tower, that's often a very effective way to get work done, as opposed to the divide, split, divide and conquer approach. Generally speaking, I've found it to be much better at saving time and not wasting it with context switching and these other things that tend to slow teams down. All right. I'm probably a little bit ahead, no, pretty much on schedule here. So I am going to just give a quick shout out to the upcoming program here that's going to be happening, the upcoming course. There's a link here. There's a promo code if anybody is interested in it. I get into a lot more depth in a lot of these things, and I also make time for people to discuss their own individual things that they might be struggling with at work or during their or on their own leadership rather journey. I love chatting and with people and talking about things that they might be encountering. So I'm happy to do that as well. Promo 15 is the promo code to get 15% off. Another thing is that Skilldemie offers 5% to basically pay for training for agile project managers and individuals in need. So it's a really great thing to support, a great cause of theirs. So this is also where some of this money goes. And that's just a shout out there. So let me get to the questions. I'm going to pause here on this stuff. That was a lot. I went through a lot of it. We only had an hour. This stuff you could spend weeks literally sort of going through and blowing up and dissecting. I sort of did some quick hit stuff, and I'll get to some of the questions now. Okay, so the first one is, who should be the first person you speak to in an organization when campaigning for agile adoption? That's a good question. Before even, I mean, I lean towards getting buy-in from the leadership, the most senior leadership that you possibly can get to, because I believe that successful agile adoptions, they don't start at the bottom in terms of the ones that I've seen be most successful. They start at the top. And if you can get your leaders at the top, at least at the department level, to buy in, I find that generally goes better than some of these. It's only because of my own experience. It may work differently in some of your organizations. The grassroots movements can be successful to a degree, but I find they eventually hit a wall. Usually these teams are isolated or insulated, like a little bubble. They can make some great progress because there's things that you could adopt with Scrum and other practices that do provide benefit, even if the rest of your organization isn't agile. But eventually, what I've seen is you'll hit the wall. And the wall is what I call that boundary layer between the team environment and the rest of the organization, which inevitably you're going to have to cross and interact with certain things, whether it's with budgets, with hiring, with roadmaps, approvals, freedom to make decisions, that type of stuff. Every organization is unique and has their own organization, their own context. So, you can get some of these answers without even talking to a leader. Talk to other teams, talk to people, and if you work there yourself, you can take a look at your context, understand your context, and I'll refer back to that one slide that asks the simple question. Look at the agile values in the manifesto. There's just 4 of them. And ask yourself and ask others if you want their feedback and input. And I encourage you to do so. Ask them, how well does our company align to these values? Because even if someone at an executive level says, yep, I'll support an agile adoption because they think it's going to be all this great performance and they don't have to get their hands dirty. But if the company fundamentally doesn't believe in those things, you're really going to struggle with agile. You will. You'll get some progress out of it, and I've seen that as well. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think the expectation level is pretty high for a lot of folks, especially at the leadership level, that if we're going to do this big agile adoption, if we're going to spend all this money and all these resources, bring in coaches and all the rest of it, they're expecting a lot. So the expectation bar usually gets set really high. And if it's an organization that doesn't align to those values really well, it becomes a real letdown for a lot of folks, especially the people in the teams that are working so hard to try to work in that way. Let's move on to the next one here. Sorry, that took me a while. Let me try to get through these a little quicker here. My apologies. Zainab asks, how can I navigate as a new Scrum Master or PM with no tech background? That's a great question as well. So my experience is a little different, right? So I was a developer for a part of my career, and then I led and managed development teams. So I've always been involved and relatively close to technology, but that doesn't mean you can't be effective. Um, I've seen some really effective Scrum Masters who weren't technical. I think it helps you if you are technical, but I don't think it's necessarily, a mandate or a hard requirement to be successful and to help people. At the end of the day, a Scrum Master, does a lot of things around facilitation. And when I talk about creating that environment where people can be successful, having courage, showing leadership, sometimes Scrum Masters have to have tough conversations with the members of their team and those that maybe are stakeholders or leaders within the organization in order to create that environment. That doesn't necessarily need to be technical. And remember, the Agile Manifesto isn't a technical document, even though it was created by some of the most technical individuals in the industry. It talked about values and principles. So your role is to help operate and work in ways that are very much similar and aligned to what's in the Agile Manifesto. And it's about creating those environments and those ways of working that align to that. And if you can do that, you don't necessarily need to be technical to do that. But you do, I think, need to be courageous because there's going to be some courageous conversations that you're going to have. So be prepared for that. Anonymous, how do you see people management evolving as technology changes? And what advice would you give new managers entering the field? Okay, so great question. People management and technology. So technology is something that, as I sort of gave the quickest history known to man of the Agile Manifesto and what was going on in the industry at the time, technology, changes all the time. I personally see technology as, some really, really powerful tools, but that's exactly what they are. And that's why I believe the Agile Manifesto never talked about technology or tools. They talked about people. They talked about interactions. They talked about responding to change. They talked about those types of values as being most important. And that document, now almost 25 years old, is still relevant. The technologies have come and gone. I mean, none of us use technologies that are 25 years old, hopefully. And if you do, my apologies. But the technologies will continue to evolve and change. And if you are a technical manager of people, then staying abreast of technologies is definitely to your advantage. And I recommend you do that because that's going to help your team as well for you to be, involved in understanding the evolution and change that's happening within the technology space. But to create those environments that are described in the manifesto doesn't require technology. Someone, who understands the fundamentals of Agile can certainly be effective at doing that, provided that what you're expected to do isn't necessarily technical. And again, it comes back to your context in your organization. Is your organization the type of organization that works and operates in those ways? Or does it work and operate a little differently? And then you need to sort of just, adjust accordingly. Rajat, welcome. I know you. For companies where you mentioned agile doesn't work, what methodologies did work for those? Well, what worked in some of those organizations ended up being really a hybrid of agile. They borrowed the parts of agile that they could apply and they could use, and they kind of changed or threw away the parts that didn't. I mean, that's, just to be brutally honest, that's kind of what happened. And, despite my opinion on that matter, it did produce some results. Did it unlock all of the potential that I believe existed within those teams? No, I didn't. But that doesn't mean they weren't able to deliver value, to do some pretty incredible work. But I think over time, if that company can start shifting towards more of those things that are described in the manifesto, I think they'll be pleasantly surprised. But those things are harder to change if they're ingrained, if the opposite is ingrained in your culture and in your values as an organization. So just be mindful of that, because those are really hard. Following practices, adopting tools, relatively speaking, are not as hard as changing your values, the things you believe in. Those are really, really hard in my experience to change, especially among the leadership at the very top of the organization. So just be mindful of that. Those shifts happen slowly, but there is still value from Agile, whether you're adopting Scrum or something else. You can take some of that and it still applies. There's still value there, and you can still get some really, really important, incredible work done and still make progress. Shazadi, how do you handle disagreement on story points amongst developers? Story points. This is a contentious one. So, one person, if I talk to them, they would probably advise don't use story points. Another person would say, and I've used certainly story points, that they're they're helpful if I think you use them in the right way. When there's disagreement between developers, I tend to lean towards the higher estimate at the end of the day. Um, Story points are a relative form of relative estimation mechanism or technique. So it's not perfect anyway. And I think that's where I've gone wrong, is where I've overly scrutinized, painstakingly, I sweated over the value of story points and when things are going to be due and how do we translate from from story points to time. And I think they are estimates at the end of the day. And if you leave room in your sprint, the story points, they're 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 going to be pretty good, but they're going to change and shift over time as well. Especially if your team shifts and changes, like you add or remove members of the team. The story points that the previous team or the version of the team had created are going to now kind of feel and look a little bit different when that team has either added or removed members. So these things tend to kind of shift and move a little bit. I try not to overly fixate on them, but they are helpful. And I definitely don't use story points of one team and try to compare them against the story points in another team. They're very much context specific. But if developers are generally arguing and it's a matter of a few points, I'm not talking about a 1 story point and an 18. I'm talking about, like a 5 and an 8. Lean towards the 8 is what I typically do, generally speaking. Everything kind of washes out over a period of several sprints anyway. It's not going to be that critical, and it's usually not worth the amount of time and energy to get into very deep debates over, a couple story points. Sorry, let's move on here. Shazadi again. Okay. What is your take on prioritization of sprints are being completing and work is being carried over sprint over sprint? Oh, okay. So yeah, work that sort of carries over. Yeah, that one, I'm just trying to recall back on some actual examples. That certainly has happened in numerous scenarios before, where basically um, there's likely at least one thing probably happening here. The sprint is likely being overloaded anyway. That's so when I've seen that happen, where there's a lot of work carried from one sprint to the next, it's usually in my experience, has been a result of too much work has gone into the sprint to begin with, or there's been a tremendous amount of disruption during the sprint. A lot of unplanned work has come in and just thrown your numbers off. So, you know, that will work will not be completed in a sprint if those things tend to happen. So one of the tactics I use again is go lower on the sprint backlog. Don't fill it up. Leave it at least a minimum of 20% available. In fact, if you can even go lower than that, but I mean higher than that percentage, even better. Again, the team will just pull in work. If the team is trusted, that they're doing their best, work will be pulled in. Unless there's another issue here at play that probably is worth talking about. Trust the team to figure out what needs to be pulled in and when to pull it in. Don't overload it, because that creates a lot of cognitive load as well. When you have so much to think about, it does again create a pressure in terms of on the members of the team, and stress and pressure doesn't help in terms of performance. So you want to keep those at a manageable level if you can. What are some of the biggest surprises or challenges you faced when transitioning from an individual contributor to a manager? Yeah, that's a great question. Um, wow. The biggest challenge was, you're now shifting, at least for me, I shifted from someone who is used to, writing code to managing people and not writing code as much as I used to. So that requires, you to be trusting to a large extent the people who are now responsible for that activity. That was a bit of a hard transition for me. And what happened with me was, at first I started trying to do both. I started trying to focus on, well, how do I be a better manager and all of those responsibilities while I'm still trying to write code? And what that inevitably left me was sort of like one foot in both camp, where you end up in this sort of, oh no, I'm turning into this jack of all trades, master of none. Stay close to the technology would be my advice, but you have to let go of it to an extent and focus on being a better manager. And my advice again to my younger self, and maybe to you if it applies to your context, is focus on creating that environment where your team of developers, maybe in this case, can be successful, right? Get the things that are holding them up out of their way. The things that are overloading them and hurting their performance, try to make that better for them, and they will be more productive. Yes, you have experience and a technical background, and that's going to come in handy for sure, because you can be there helping facilitate conversations, whether it's talking about architecture and design and some of these other things. That's all great. You should be there. You might even serve as a tiebreaker in certain cases where you're making technical decisions. But you do need to start thinking about how to let go, and then how to help build a great team around you. Participate in the hiring process. As a developer, you know what to look for in other developers. So engage yourself in that, because you are now hopefully helping grow and build a team, and you want to find the best people to fit within that team. And that includes technical skills. It includes also behavioral sort of alignment with your existing team. Those things are all important. Okay. Zainab, how can you establish credibility and trust with your team as a new manager? Um, so if you're a new manager, and I've been a new manager in a number of occasions, what tends to work, I find work pretty well, is get to know the people, right? A lot of these things that I've talked about here, um, and certainly those areas, those four areas of focus initially, a lot like the last one about building trust. As a leader, you're trying to establish trust. You really do need to build relationships with people. The most effective leaders and the times where I've been most effective was when I had good relationships, and that took work. I had to spend time to do that, and it was important. It was valuable. Your team needs to know and feel that they can trust you, and that you have their back, and that you're there to help see them be successful. You're not there for your own interests, right? And that's something that people feel. People are very sensitive that way, and that's a good thing, because when you can establish that type of bond and connection with your team works incredibly well. So think about that, right? Being a manager, is your responsibility is, you know, putting others first, putting your team first, building those relationships. That is all part of your work. It's not this nice to have thing that you do if you have time to do it. Like it really think about, make sure you spend time and create that time for your team and every single member of your team, and think about how you can help them grow. And that's going to start establishing and building a lot of trust as a manager. And last but not least, if you say you're going to do something, do it. And if you say you're not going to do something, don't do it. Like, keep to your word. One of the things that hurts credibility the most is, a manager of a team or of people that says one thing and does another, that promises something and then doesn't come through with their promises, or, makes a poor decision and doesn't own up and take responsibility for it. Those things absolutely hurt and can destroy credibility and any sort of trust that you're trying to establish with your team. So please be mindful of that. Okay, last question here, Zanab. What resources or training helped you most as a new manager, and where do you suggest new managers start? Um, Training. So
I mean, definitely with Skilldemie, right?
sorry.
Hey,
Yes, Rush, thank you. That is absolutely the correct answer. There is valuable training, and you should go for valuable training. I'm not just saying this because I'm part of Skilldemie here, but because training outfits you with, a lot of the fundamentals. But what really accelerates, that impact you can have is applying it. And certainly within training, you can do that, and that is valuable, but make sure you take it into your environment, because training, and even the hands-on training, which is super valuable. And again, Skilldemie does a lot of that here, in case you wanted to know. It really, again, I mentioned context and being very aware of your context. In a training environment, it's very safe, right? It's very controlled. In your actual live environment, it's kind of like you're a soldier and you're going from the training ground into an actual war. So know your context, and then, be very thoughtful about trying to apply the skills and the things you've learned in your real environment, because you may find you may need to adapt and tweak those a little bit, because some of the things that you thought you could control or have a say in, you may not be able to. So just be aware of that, because those live environments can be shifting under your feet in real time, and you really need to be sort of aware of what's going on and understand your context. All right, I think we actually got through all the questions. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the time. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for the questions. They're great questions. Certainly we can go a lot deeper in a lot of these, but I don't want to keep anybody. If anybody has any questions for me outside of this session, by all means, feel free to contact me over LinkedIn. My email also is dkuzmar@gmail.com. Feel free to reach out there. Happy to answer, happy to even have a conversation with you about something that you might be experiencing at work. Again, context is important. Like some of these questions, I'm also interpreting the context a little bit, so my answers may be somewhat incomplete. The more I understand about your context, the better I can also offer some advice. So, and I'm happy to do so. So thank you again. Rush, anything else before we wrap?
yeah, thank you guys for joining. It's great to see some familiar faces. As you guys know, Dennis is starting a new master class. We do have a promo that's going on. The promo code is promo 15, and 5% of all tuition does go towards providing agile training for individuals in needs through partnership with local shelters and non-for-profit organizations. We're aiming, or our aim is by 2027 to have provided about 100 free training and PSM certifications to folks. So that's something that we're working towards. And thank you guys for listening in and listening to Dennis with his in-depth knowledge in people management and technology.
Great. Thanks, Rush. Thanks, everybody. Have yourselves a wonderful night, and take care.